Rioting Stops, and no dumbest bill in America, but we also have a new segment that we're adding, which is called Go Woke or Go Broke. This is Mark Fisher of Mark and the Millennials, and the millennial joining me today is, of course, our podcast assistant producer, which is Christopher Hopkins, and, of course, Adam Katora. And, of course, we're so happy that you're joining us for this podcast called And the Rioting Stops. And, of course, Go Woke or Go Broke, the new segment that we're going to try to do oftentimes every week in the podcast. So first up, I'm going to call this the Decision Desk President. So this is the Decision Desk President. That's what we're going to at least call it for now. The Decision Desk President, because the news media, they have decided to call this election for Joe Biden at their decision desks. Yes, not the American people, but the decision desks. And the way this actually works with the Electoral colleges, on December 8th, the state legislatures choose electors who then go to the Electoral College on December 14th and work. So we have well over a month before we actually have a President-elect Biden or a President-elect Trump. Now, I agree with you. Obviously, you have to look at the current results, such as they stand, and say Joe Biden is clearly winning in the key states. But the decision desk president shouldn't be decided by the media. And we also have an enormous amount of questions and, voting irregularities that have been reported out of major cities. Look, let me just ask you this question, because I know that we have podcast listeners, by the way, and I'm thankful that we do have podcast listeners who are on the other side of the aisle. Thank you. I appreciate you listening, but you have to at least agree to this. We will never as a nation be able to accept presidential elections if we don't have legal votes counted and we don't allow the process to take place the way it was intended to. Namely, have the votes counted, make sure that people aren't cheating, provide confidence on a state-by-state basis that that's not happening, so that during the next election, we won't have these kinds of questions. And of course, the last election in 2016, all we heard was Russian collusion. It was the Russians that got Donald Trump elected. And this particular election, I'll be the first to admit, I have a lot of questions about what's been happening in Philadelphia, Detroit, Madison, Wisconsin, and also in Fulton County, Georgia, which is the county in which Atlanta is located. Here's why. They're still counting. The election was on, last Tuesday, and they're still counting. That doesn't make any sense. We had a podcast last week where we had Governor DeSantis say, why is it that Florida, the third most populous state, can count all of its ballots and tell you the results the night of the election, but these other states that are a lot smaller can't. They keep finding votes in the wee hours of the morning, and now we are nearly a week after the election, nearly a week, and we still don't have the votes counted in those states. And I'm just sorry, that's super sketchy. Agreed. December 8th is when state legislatures choose the electors, and that's when you know for sure that those electors are committed to voting in the Electoral College for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. That's the way it works. We do know that. But we have we have a month now to be able to determine who actually won these states. But that should have been decided last Tuesday. And it hasn't been. And so this whole thing, so look, there's a big difference between the way Republicans see elections and the way Democrats see elections, especially presidential elections. So Republicans, the way they see elections is they say, you know what? I'm not happy with the way this election is going. I'm not happy with the fact that the election wasn't decided on Tuesday and that people apparently are still voting. Remember that before the election? People are voting already. Well, apparently people are still voting already. So, especially in certain states, and we know which states those are. But Republicans are arguing about the fact that we want to make sure there's no fraud and there's no ballot harvesting and there's no cheating. And that is a perfectly legitimate question to bring up. I think it is, right? And you've heard me bring it up. You've heard other folks who have podcasts and radio shows. They brought it up, and it's legit. And we're going to talk about that throughout this podcast. We have quite a few supportive clips that really kind of make sense and help build the case for making sure that all the votes are truly counted, that our legal votes are counted. But first, do you remember the decorum of the Hillary Democrats 4 years ago? Well, you see the Republican decorum this year in 2020. Our decorum is, look, we're not happy. We think that there are voting irregularities. We think mass ballot mailing out has caused enormous amounts of fraud, or at the very least has provided an opportunity in these blue cities for fraud. I think we're going to find that too. I do. I'm not sure it'll be enough to change the outcome of the election. Not suggesting that, but we don't know. I mean, it's 2020, anything's possible. So if you remember the decorum of the Hillary Democrats 4 years ago, well, here's a quick example of the way they act when they lose versus the way we act when things aren't necessarily at the moment going our way. We have that clip, and here it is.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama. What
a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald.
Tap on the shoulder. You adjust the microphone as you told, man.
So that's Democrat decorum. It's like, no! And, you know, that is, I'm sorry, that is, I want my trophy. I lost, but I still want my trophy, so I go home and show mama. Sorry, that's the way I see it as a Republican. Because I will tell you, yes, this election has been, it's difficult to watch. It's very difficult. It was difficult to watch the first debate, too. We talked about that in a previous podcast. We did not think Donald Trump did such a hot job in the first debate. And he may have paid the price for that in this election. But let's face it, the deck was completely and utterly stacked against him. And what I want to make sure, as a conservative, is that the deck isn't stacked against him in an election where massive fraud was undertaken in major cities with ballot harvesting. And in order, even if you are a far left progressive and you're listening to this podcast, you have a responsibility, as do we, to make sure that every election that is held in the future has the American people's utmost confidence that the election was held in a free and fair manner. And we have a process, and we're going through that process. And as I said, we're going to talk about that process with a number of clips in this podcast about why it's important to be able to regain that confidence that American elections are actually followed in such a way that there is confidence, 100% confidence. So before we go there, Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post said on MSNBC a year ago, this is a year ago, but we're bringing this up because apparently AOC has said the same thing. Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, if you want to really call it, we call it the Washington Compost. Back when I was in college, we called it Pravda on the Potomac because Pravda was the newspaper in the Soviet Union. So we always thought that they were parroting Pravda, but now they're just parroting the woke crowd. So Jennifer Rubin, a year ago, said that, you know what, when Donald Trump loses, we're going to purge the GOP and the entire Republican Party. Very scary stuff that even anyone would say this, but of course it was on MSNBC. Anything's possible on MSNBC. We have that clip, and here it is.
It's not only that Trump has to lose, but that all his enablers have to lose. We have to collectively, in essence, burn down the Republican Party. We have to level them, because if there are survivors, if there are people who weathered this storm, they will do it again. They will take this as confirmation that, hey, it just pays to ride the waves. Look at me, I've made it through. And so up and down the ticket, federal, state, local offices, the country has to repudiate this.
Yeah, so the country has to repudiate this. We have to just really burn down the Republican Party. We need to purge the Republican Party. You know what? In a country that is a republic and it's a democratic republic, what we want is for there to be a two-party system at a minimum. You don't want to burn down a party so that you have a one-party state. That never goes so well throughout world history. But if you work for the Washington Post, you can say these incredibly stupid things, but they're also dangerous, right? They're also incredibly dangerous. And who else said something incredibly stupid and dangerous? Who else but AOC? She says, she's facing heat for wanting to archive online posts by Trump sycophants. So listen to this. So AOC said just this week the same thing that Rubin said at the Washington Post a year ago, but AOC's saying it right now. It's like, get this. She's saying that I hope that someone is archiving these Trump sycophants for when they try to downplay or deny their complicity in the future. I foresee decent probability of many deleted tweets, writings, photos in the future, the lawmaker wrote. In other words, she's basically saying there should be a list. There should be a list and an archive of all the people who are sycophants because they dared support Donald Trump online in some way. Or they wrote something favorable about the policies of Donald Trump. So AOC, guess what? That would be some 70 million plus people right now who voted for Donald Trump. So you're basically calling the deplorables, now they're sycophants. See, we used to be deplorables under Hillary Clinton. Now under AOC, we are sycophants. Imagine the kind of mental health problem you must have if you were writing off half of the country. I gotta tell you, podcast listeners, including the progressive podcast listeners, thank you for listening. I always say that because I do appreciate that. You can't write off half of the country. I don't write off half of the country. Do you think I don't listen to the other half of the country who voted against Donald Trump? Do you think that I just write them off and say, no, their problem is they all need to be, put on a list, and in the future we need to purge them and make sure that they go through re-education camps, maybe with the Uyghurs in China? But that's kind of what these people think. I don't think that. I want a two-party system. I want a vigorous two-party system, but I want a two-party system where people don't think it's appropriate to try to, exterminate the opposition. That's what it sounds like. It's sick. Ladies and gentlemen, that is just sick. But that's, unfortunately, the thought leaders, if you will, of the Democrat Party, including the so-called journalists and editorialists at the Washington Post, otherwise known as Jeff Bezos' playground in journalism. So we have a 2020 down-ballot election summary. It's a 2020 down-ballot election summary. How do Republicans win 28 of the 29 most competitive seats, gain control of 3 state legislatures, and not lose a single House race by an incumbent in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, but Joe Biden still wins? It is kind of questionable, okay? That's why we need to take our time and count the votes and then do recounts and make sure there was no fraud or cheating in these blue cities in particular. And by all means, recount the vote in red counties as well. I don't have a problem with that. Why would I? Please, be fair, count the votes everywhere you think there might be election fraud. 100% for that. I want complete election confidence, and I will tell you, once I have that, I'll accept the election results. But I need to have that first in order to be confident. So Maria Bartiromo, she summarizes the down-ballot races, and she does really a good job. And she interviews Kevin McCarthy. He's the House Minority Leader in the House of Representatives. And we have a series of clips on this. And here first is Maria Bartiromo.
Welcome back. Big victories in the 2020 congressional races, with early numbers showing that the GOP gained at least 4 million new voters, with President Trump receiving more non-white votes than any Republican candidate in 60 years. House Republicans are also expecting up to 13 new seats, with victories for incoming women, veterans, minorities.
4 million new voters. 4 million new voters. Think about that. That a party that is falling apart doesn't gain 4 million new voters. A party that has been rebuked at the polls does not gain 4 million new voters. I do believe, however, that the Democrats did probably get 5 million new dead voters, but I digress. I think that's entirely possible, too. If not dead voters, then voters that just don't exist. I think that's entirely possible, particularly in Philadelphia and Detroit and Madison, Wisconsin. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So here's Maria Bartiromo talking to Kevin McCarthy, and he does a good job also summarizing the down ballot races. It's very interesting, and here's that clip.
Well, what we need in the presidential race is to make sure every legal vote is counted, every recount is completed, and every legal challenge should be heard. Then and only then that America will decide who won the race. Remember, Maria, we are less than 21,000 votes away where the House we could win the majority. There are a number of seats, 10 seats that are still sitting out there. Republicans are leading in 3. They haven't called any of those. So why would you call the presidential race first?
Interesting, huh? Interesting. I thought that was a really good point Kevin McCarthy made. There are quite a few House races that haven't been called yet because there is meticulous counting and recounting of the vote because the races are very close. And Kevin McCarthy's basically saying, look, we need to know and we need confidence in who won those races. And because they are so close, we want to make sure that there's no election fraud, that there's no vote tampering, that there's no software glitch, of course, which happened in Michigan. We want to make sure, and it's perfectly reasonable. It doesn't matter which party you're from. It's a perfectly reasonable. That's why we have until the 8th of December to do just all of those things, because 8th of December is the drop-dead hard date where the electors are chosen by the state legislatures, excuse me. So here's Kevin McCarthy again, and he does a really good job talking about the election summary. And he talks about it in a reasonable way that I think you would come away from this particular election, at least as of today, and say, wow, to be president of the United States and not to have a mandate, it's kind of a strange thing. You're kind of really just there. I'm not really sure what you can get done because you really weren't elected with any kind of mandate or agenda. Yet in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, you have all of these new Republicans who were elected. So here's McCarthy.
What happened? We didn't lose one incumbent. We won every seat except one open. We won 28 of the 29 most competitive seats that Nate Silver laid out there. We are gaining in less than 21,000 votes away. We didn't lose the Senate. We didn't lose one control of any legislature. Actually, Republicans gained 3 new legislatures of control of. And we've had the most competitive presidential race in our modern history. That's why every vote should be counted, every recount to go forward, and every challenge should be heard. Because if it's still good to keep going on these congressional seats, carrying them out, I think we should actually do that as well for the highest office in the land.
Yeah, and that video quality, by the way, wasn't us. It was the actual original video, which they had some issues with. But McCarthy basically talks about, hey, look, how can you have this success in the lower house and say to yourself, no, we're done counting at the presidential level, but at the lower house level, in the House of Representatives, we need to keep counting. So do you hear any Democrats saying, oh no, stop the count in the House of Representatives. We still have, 8 seats that we haven't decided who won them yet. Stop the count. Stop. No, you don't see that happening, but you do see it happening at the presidential desk, at the presidential decision desk where they say, stop the count. Joe Biden is the projected winner. And we should not count anymore. This is the problem that I have, and every other American has the same problem. I'm sure of it. Every other American, I'm talking about the 70 million that voted for Donald Trump. You can't have votes just show up days after the election and say, guess what? We found another tranche of 100,000 votes. We found another tranche of 50,000 votes. Oh no, now we found another tranche of 100,000 votes. How can you not know how many votes you have by the end of the election day? And I know what the Democrats are going to say. Well, the reason why is because we mailed a ballot to everybody, and we just don't know how many of those are out there and actually have been cast. That's the problem with mailing a ballot to everybody. You just can't do that. So in the meantime, the media suspends critical thinking skills altogether. So get this, podcast listeners, the media in 2020 has completely and utterly suspended their critical thinking skills. I think you already know that. But we have proof of that. And we have proof of how inappropriate they are in coverage of this election. And it's one more reason why 70 million Americans are saying, you know what? I'm not really sure about this election, because even the media seems like they're not being fair. What a surprise. So first up, CNN's Anderson Cooper compares Trump to a turtle. This is when Anderson Cooper had decided in his own mind that Trump was going to lose the election, election day. And I'm sorry. Can you imagine being an anchor and saying such a thing? Can you imagine being even serious and saying, we have that clip and here it is.
That is the president of the United States. That is the most powerful person in the world. And we see him like an obese turtle on his back, flailing in the hot sun, realizing his time is over.
So, I'm laughing because Anderson Cooper is acting so serious. Like, you know, I'm a really intelligent anchor and I just know that people are following me on this, and I've got some breaking news. The president is like a turtle flailing on his back. I mean, really? This is news? This is news? It's like Saturday Night Live. It's like a parody. I mean, it's hard to believe. So we also have CNN's Jake Tapper, who spoke after the Donald Trump press conference, and I want you to know this. CBS, ABC, and MSNBC all broke out of the Trump press conference election night. And so you probably didn't hear this because I'm sure most podcast listeners don't watch those phony shows, namely CBS, ABC, MSNBC. If you want to call them, they're really shows, not even newscasts. But every single one of them broke away from the Trump press conference the night of the election, and they did so before it was finished. Would that be normal? If you have so many people engaged in this election, why would you break away from the press conference? Wouldn't you want to hear everything that Donald Trump said, even if you get triggered when he talks? You still, it's what a free society does. You don't censor the sitting president of the United States, even if you don't like what he says, but they can't even handle it because their viewers can't handle it. So here's CNN's Jake Tapper after Donald Trump spoke at his press conference, and he breaks away from the press conference right after the press conference to his credit. So I just want to clarify that. CNN, you did have an opportunity to see the whole press conference. Then Jake Tapper decides he's going to break away and say a few things. You have to hear what Jake Tapper decides to say. It's really strange. This is election night, and here it is.
What a sad night for the United States of America to hear their president say that, to falsely accuse people of trying to steal the election, to try to attack democracy that way with this feast of falsehoods. Lie after lie after lie about the election being stolen. No evidence for what he's saying, just smears about the integrity of vote counting in state after state. When he wins a state, it's legitimate. When he loses, it's because the vote is being stolen.
So that, again, that's almost as bad as Anderson Cooper comparing Trump to a turtle. This is Jake Tapper saying it's so sad for a president to do that. So look, if you believe that you were cheated in some sort of business dealing, okay, let's just say you went to a store and you decided to pay in cash, and the cashier gives you your change and doesn't give you sufficient change, and you know that they've made an error. And you say to the cashier, you've made an error, I gave you a $100 bill, and you didn't give me my change properly. And are you supposed to have, I don't know, Jake Tapper get in the middle of you and go, it's really sad that you're questioning what this person did. You should never question what this person behind the register just did because they are always right. That is not the job of the media. A media is supposed to be a critical thinking organization where it allows the news to get out, such as it is, whether they like it or not, and they report it. But they're not supposed to opine election night as to whether they think there is or isn't election fraud, because one candidate thinks there is, and one candidate has 70 million people behind them who think the same thing. So that is so important. It's so important that we have a country that is confident in the elections. I can't say that enough. And if you're a Democrat and you think that you should suspend your critical thinking skills when your guy wins, or if you're a Republican and you think you should suspend your critical thinking skills when your guy wins, you're both wrong. All right? Our country can't survive unless people agree that we must get to, I don't know, a free and fair media that has critical thinking skills, and at the same time have free and fair elections and not have mass mail-out balloting, which is cheating. I'm sorry. I think it's wrong. I think it's rife for cheating. So here's MSNBC's Brian Williams. Keep in mind, MSNBC was one of the networks that cut away from the president's press conference, the election night, long before he was finished. And they cut away a minute after the president started. And here's what Brian Williams of MSNBC said. Here's that clip.
I've already decisively won many critical states, including massive victories in Florida, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio.
Okay, here we are again in the unusual position of not only interrupting the President of the United States, but correcting the President of the United States.
So here's the media. Here's the media. A hard news anchor, such as he is, Brian Williams, is correcting the President of the United States. He's correcting him. So he's not reporting what the President said, and he's not saying, well, why don't we see some proof of what the President is alleging? He's correcting the President of the United States. Folks, that is not the function of the media. It's also not how our elections work, right? Once again, we have a full month for there to be recounts and for there to be lawsuits and for there to be all kinds of questions and things that you might expose that happened that at least create, and if you don't have them, fine. If they don't exist, then that's great. Report that. But Brian Williams is like, he's not the least bit interested in reporting any kind of possibility. He's just basically saying, oh no, this guy won, and this guy lost, and the guy that lost is just a sore loser. I got to tell you something. 70 million people don't agree with you. They don't agree. And if you want proof of what I'm saying, of why 70 million people have a question about this election, here's the proof. Here's the proof of why 70 million people question what happened. Because the Democrats, prior to the election, filed over 300 lawsuits in key swing states. Prior to the actual election, they filed 300 lawsuits. And some of the lawsuits were lawsuits that said, we want counting to continue after the election. We want ballots to be accepted that don't have an actual postmark on them. These are some of the lawsuits the Democrats filed. We want there to be more early voting, but really what they wanted, the Democrats, the moral of the story is their litigation was to not just count way before the election, like 5 weeks, and have people vote 5 weeks before the election. They want counting to continue after the election. They don't want a date certain of an election until the result is achieved. That is the best way to summarize their lawsuits. And these were lawsuits before the election. So if you're a Donald Trump supporter, right, and let's just say you agree with 75% of what he does, you don't like the way he handles himself, but you support his policies, you do want to see, and you at least want to understand that when the other side, when the other party has all of these lawsuits, you have to ask yourself the question and scratch your head and say, why would anyone file lawsuits to allow counting to continue after an election where you don't have to match signatures on ballots, ballots don't have to be postmarked? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. That's cheating. I'm sorry, that is cheating. And the Democrat Party, through their lawyers, were encouraging, through litigation, massive cheating. And so now the question is, post-election, did that actually occur? And if so, should it have been allowed? So this is what all this litigation is going to be about now, post-election. So we also have Ted Cruz, who's done a really good job, I have to admit. He's done a great job summarizing this election as well. And Ted Cruz talks about, well, who determines the winner of the presidency? And I think Cruz is uniquely qualified, obviously because he's a constitutional scholar and he's also a United States Senator. And I know that whenever he gets on radio or TV, of course, it drives the left crazy. But nonetheless, he really provides some calm to this particular subject matter. So we have a number of clips with Ted Cruz talking about this issue, and I think he does a great job. These are definitely worth listening to. And so first up, here's Cruz.
Well, I think that is way premature. At this point, we do not know who has prevailed in the election. The media is desperately trying to get everyone to coronate Joe Biden as the next president. But that's not how it works. The media does not get to select our president. The American people get to elect our president.
Yeah, so, the media doesn't select our president. The decision desk at Fox News doesn't determine the presidency. They don't say, well, the decision desk, some bogus name that we gave a bunch of people in the back room, they decide who the president is. No. The American people decide, and then ultimately the Electoral College, state legislatures decide because they choose the electors, and then the Electoral College obviously has voting that occurs. And that's when the presidency is actually chosen. Cruz does a great job because I think that that's really the disconnect between this election between Biden and Trump, namely that the American people feel like the media has been unfair way before the election, and then during the election, and now post-election, the media is like doubling down on being unfair. So here's Cruz talking about the massive mail-in ballots. We've talked about this a lot this podcast. We've talked about it in the past. Other people have talked about it. Cruz does a great job summarizing this, and we have that clip, and here it is.
What is interesting is historically, mail-in votes are much more likely to be disqualified in a recount than in-person votes. Generally, in-person votes, they're conducted at the polling place, and then they usually stand. That means what we're likely to see in the next few weeks as the recounts go forward is that Joe Biden's very, very narrow majorities in some of these states, those totals are likely to drop if we see mail-in votes when they're examined being invalidated as contrary to the law. And so we could easily see, I believe President Trump still has a path to victory, and that path is to count every single legal vote that was cast, but also not to cast any votes that were fraudulently cast or illegally cast. And we have a legal process to determine what's legal and what isn't.
And that's the process that's happening right now. And that's why the decision desk shouldn't be announcing that there is a winner of the presidency. There is someone who is winning, clearly, and according to the Electoral College, there's someone who does appear to have more than 270 or more votes, and that's Joe Biden. But we also have this question of massive mail-in ballots. And in fact, Justice Alito ordered the state of Pennsylvania to set aside the mail-in ballots that came in after Election Day. Now, of course, that's going to be a hard job for the people of Philadelphia because I'm sure they have already separated the envelopes from the mail-in ballot and the envelopes having the postmark. I'm sure that's already been done. And I'm sure all those envelopes have been disposed upon, have been probably shredded or burned, or they're in some landfill somewhere. Doesn't change the fact that the Supreme Court, via Justice Alito, told Pennsylvania, you know what, those mail-in ballots that arrived just mysteriously after Election Day, got to set them aside. We're not saying they're not being counted, they just have to be set aside so we can take a look at them. And of course, Ted Cruz explained that beautifully, that's the danger of mail-in ballots, and you need to make sure that you have a process to restore confidence in whether or not they should be counted. So get this, podcast listeners, in Fulton County, Georgia, that's where Atlanta is, this just came out, this came over the wire, 132,000 mail-in ballots in Fulton County, Georgia have been identified and maybe are ineligible because they were flagged as change of address ballots. So Fulton County, Georgia has about 1 million people that live there, and apparently 132,000 of those ballots are flagged because they're these, I don't know, they're new addresses. They're like new people. I don't know where they come from. 132,000 new voters, 132,000 changes of address. Sure makes you wonder. So once again, we need to restore confidence in the election. That's what Cruz is talking about. So we have another clip with Ted Cruz where he's talking again about the process of electing a president and why it's so important post-election in a close election to have confidence. And here is that clip.
We heard a report from one county in Michigan where the election software mistakenly counted 6,000 votes that were cast for Donald Trump. It switched them to Joe Biden. Now, they apparently caught that, but that same software is used in 47 counties throughout Michigan. That needs to be examined to determine that there's not a problem counting the votes. And the legal process is how you resolve those questions.
Yeah, so the legal process is how you resolve that question. And so if you have software that flipped 6,000 votes in a county, then you naturally would ask yourself the question, where else is that software used? Is it used just in that county? Is it used in other counties? Is it used in other states? So listen to this, podcast listeners. Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff is the chief executive, and Dianne Feinstein's husband, a major shareholder at Dominion Ballot Counting Systems. So Dominion Ballot Counting Systems just happens to be the organization and company that provides the systems for voting, and that system in Michigan where you had all those flipped ballots. Sure makes you wonder why or how it is that a politician's spouse or a politician's chief of staff has ownership in America's voting systems. I think that, I don't know about you guys, but I just feel like, shouldn't that person not be permitted to work in government in any capacity if they're selling to government the voting systems? How can they be allowed also to work in government, let alone work in elective government? How's that possible? I mean, I'm sorry, it just seems utterly impossible that that would be permitted. Yet it has been verified that that is the case. So I know folks on the left who listen to this podcast are probably going, oh, it's just another conspiracy theory. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a fact, and we need to make sure that we restore confidence and not allow these people who work for politicians to be selling anything to government. You shouldn't be working for government and then selling stuff for government. By working for government, I mean getting a paycheck from government as an employee and then selling stuff to government. It has to be and must be prohibited. It can't be permitted. It's absolutely dangerous to our democracy, and it just always seems to be the Democrat Party that engages in this thing, because Democrats, as a rule, particularly progressives, and I'm sorry to say this, they just always seem to use government as their way of getting rich. They don't understand democracy and capitalism. They think capitalism, the only people that get rich are the people that inherit money. They don't understand that you can create wealth if you're willing to do it. To them, creating wealth is what you do in government. You create wealth in government. That's where you do it. So talk about somebody who would know about cheating. Blago. So Rob Blagojevich, he's the former governor of Illinois, and yes, he did go to prison for a while until I think Donald Trump pardoned him. But Blago knows machine politics better than anyone. And if you've ever heard the term machine politics, basically Democrat machine politics, which is really what it is, it's always Democrat machine politics. It's where you use very large unions to turn out the vote. In other words, employee unions, almost always government unions, and you use those individuals to turn out the vote for Democrats, and you do so through the patronage system. You promise them jobs. And that has always worked very well in blue cities, particularly in Chicago, where of course, it's a one-party system. And the whole purpose of machine politics is to perpetuate the one-party system. So we have Rob Blagojevich. He was interviewed by Newsmax, and he discusses Democrat machine politics and what he thinks happened in this election. And okay, fine, podcast listeners, I know you're going to say, yeah, well, he's an ex-felon. Yeah, he's an ex-felon, as he said on his interview and on Newsmax, who was basically not on the plantation anymore. And then his Democrat rivals decided, you know what, we're going to turn him in and tell the authorities all the dirty stuff that he did. And Blagojevich, he agrees, he acknowledges it, that he did those things. But he had to go to prison for him because he decided to get off of the Democrat plantation. Nonetheless, who would know better about Democrat machine politics than Blago? We have that clip. You got to listen to this. Here it is.
If the question is, are the Democrats stealing votes in Philadelphia? My answer is the Pope Catholic? It's a time-honored tradition in big Democrat-controlled cities like Chicago, my hometown, Philadelphia, to do precisely what they're doing now. I've never seen it on such a magnitude. Because this, I think, is an indication of just how widespread it is, how deep it is, and I don't think it's just confined to Philadelphia. My instincts, again, coming out of Chicago Democratic politics, my instincts tell me it's going on in Atlanta, it's going on in Detroit, it's going on in Milwaukee, it's going on in Las Vegas. It's like what Justice Powell said about pornography. You can't define it, but you know it when you see it. And coming out of the Democratic Chicago political establishment, I know how they operate. They control polling places, they stop votes when their candidate's behind, and then in the wee hours of the morning, in the dark of night, the stealing starts. And we've seen that in big numbers, unprecedented numbers in this election in Michigan and in Philadelphia. It's outrageous.
So there you go. I mean, who would know better than Blago? Because that's exactly what he engaged in for most of his adult life, which is machine politics, Democrat machine politics, the Dem machine. And you have, once again, this is the issue that I have with the 2020 election, namely that you have a candidate who's overwhelmingly winning, and he's in a whole bunch of states. And then in the middle of the night, all of these votes show up. And they show up, all these ballots show up, and you're like, well, where did these come from? And of course, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, yeah, that's because we did massive mail-in voting. That's where they came from. Fine. Why didn't they arrive early enough or by election day and be counted as they came in so we would know? But no, of course not. They wait for the in-person vote on election day, which is overwhelmingly Republican, and then miraculously they decide and show up enough votes to, kind of win. How's that? And by the way, if you noticed, it's not like they're winning by 500,000 votes. They show up just enough votes so they're ahead by 20,000 or 30,000. And this is, you've heard this before. This is what is so sketchy because we thought, I was brought up in a common sense family and background where election day is when voting ends, period. You haven't cast your ballot, or if the ballot hasn't been counted by the close of the election day, then it doesn't get counted. And that's the way I prefer it. I'm sorry. If you didn't like that, you could also have voted early. So next up, podcast listeners, we have our new segment called Go Woke or Go Broke. This is our new segment called Go Woke or Go Broke. And sometimes we're going to do a company of the week, and it's a company that is run by a super woke CEO or CFO who decides to purge the organization of anyone who doesn't think the way that company tells them to think or vote the way that company tells them to vote. Or it could be a company that decides to relocate because they've just kind of had enough of where they're located, or anything in between. And that's Go Woke or Go Broke, primarily related to the private sector, because the private sector now has even been polluted, in my opinion, by progressive politics. So get this, in our Go Woke, Go Broke series, the Palantir co-founder, Joe Lonsdale, is moving his venture capital firm from Silicon Valley to Austin, Texas. And that's in part because it's more tolerant of ideological diversity, according to Joe Lonsdale. So Joe Lonsdale is a very famous Silicon Valley investor. He's invested in many different companies, and he has one company called 8VC. It's a venture capital company, and it's been in Silicon Valley for years, and now he's moving it to Austin, Texas, and he's just kind of like had it, like so many of these people who are in California. And so I'm going to read from this article because you have to listen to this. It's pretty fascinating. So first, Lonsdale was part of Palantir, of course, and he also has his venture capital firm, and he invests in a lot of different companies. So there's any number of companies that you can talk about, but they were all based in Silicon Valley. And so here's what it says. In an interview with Axios in May, Palantir CEO Alex Karp said he was living in New Hampshire. So Alex Karp is one of Joe Lonsdale's partners, if you will, and investors in of course, Palantir. And so Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir, decided, you know what, during the pandemic, I'm going to go to New Hampshire. And so Karp said he was living in New Hampshire during the pandemic and that he liked living free, in quotes, outside the Bay Area. He said he sees an increasing intolerance and monoculture in the tech industry, in particular in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so he went to New Hampshire and he just wanted to live free because he couldn't even do it in the place where he's made, many billions of dollars. So conversely, Lonsdale, who's described himself as a contrarian and appears to hold conservative viewpoints sometimes, it's more like libertarian to be honest with you, tweets that he decided to move to Austin for a variety of reasons, but implied that he disagrees with the way the government is run in California, as well as the culture that is developed in Silicon Valley. Here's what Joe Lonsdale said. He said, you know what? Austin, Texas is far more tolerant of ideological diversity than San Francisco. And he tweets, it's generally a good idea to have awesome left-wing hippies around where you live for great culture and music and food, that kind of thing. I just don't want them in charge of running the state. So I thought that was a really great way of putting it. It's like, I don't mind having them around because they make life interesting, but when they actually get in charge of the state, that's kind of a problem because they run the state into the ground and they run the region into the ground. And you've heard this company after company moving out of California, in particular California, but also New York and also Chicago. And they're leaving those states and they're going somewhere else. And when they leave, they always have parting shots of their state, which is, hey, you know what? I'm a liberal, is what they say. They say, I'm a liberal, but they go on to say, I can't even take where I'm living because it's no longer a liberal state, because liberal means critical thinking and the ability to listen to other opinions. Progressivism means you're intolerant of any opinions. I mean, it's very Stalinist. And that is what the Silicon Valley area has become. So we're going to do that is go woke or go broke. And we're going to do that every single podcast that we can, because there's so many of these examples that you're going to be able to see coming forward, especially after Joe Biden presidency. I mean, I think you're going to see people trying to escape these high-tax states left and right. So, we started out this podcast talking about and the rioting stops, and I just want to end the podcast by saying this. You've heard us talk about the election and the lack of critical thinking skills in the media, the lack of critical thinking skills in the private sector in our Go Woke or Go Broke series. And also, you've heard us talk about the fact that so many people don't understand how a president is elected and that it's okay to contest an election and make sure that there's no vote fraud for that purpose, for that limited purpose. But I think it's really interesting how all of the rioting has stopped. Imagine, in Washington, D.C., where I live near, because we do this podcast from Annapolis, Maryland, much of the city of Washington, D.C. was boarded up before the election. And there was a major exodus from the city because people were terrified of what might happen. And I think it's fascinating that the rioting has stopped because I guess it's because there's a perception at the moment that Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. So what does that tell you? What does that tell me? It tells me that the rioters were Democrats. right? Because I don't see any of Republicans, the 70 million people, Republicans, independents, and Democrats who voted for Donald Trump, and he did. He got plenty of Democrats, old Democrats in particular, the critical thinking Democrats, the ones that are left at least. Lots of independents, obviously Republicans. He got 4 million more votes, expanded the Republican Party by 4 million more votes. And out of those 70 million people, I don't see any of those people in Portland, Oregon, or Washington, D.C., or Chicago, Illinois, or New York City, or any other place for that matter. I don't see them rioting. Why is that? Why is that? And it tells you an incredible amount about this country and where we are today in the 20th century and in 2020. We have one party that absolutely was complicit in the rioting because they refused to say that rioting is bad and it's not the right way to comport yourself when you disagree with your opponents. And we have another side that is clearly saying, look, we do question this election and we want absolute confidence that this election was free and that it was fair and that there wasn't massive cheating. And we deserve that as a minimum. But you know what we're not doing? We're not out there breaking windows. We're not out there hurting people. We're not out there in any way, shape, or form trying to intimidate people sitting outside in cafes in Washington, D.C., or Portland, Oregon, or anyone else for that matter who's going about their lives, because that's not what we do. That's not how we comport ourselves. And I just got to tell you something. If you are a liberal or a progressive or whoever you are and you voted for Joe Biden, ask yourself that question, because I've called this podcast "And the Rioting Stops." And yeah, that's right. And the rioting has stopped. And isn't it a shame? Isn't it a shame that we live in a country where one party can't accept the fact that sometimes things don't go their way? And I know what you're saying, Democrats. I know what you're saying, progressives. You're saying, oh, that's what you're saying, Mark. No, actually, I haven't said that at all this podcast. I said, I accept the results of an election, but I want to make sure that from this point forward, there is absolute confidence that elections are called the night of the election rather than 3, 4, 5, 6 days later. It just seems super sketchy to me. And so that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. I want to thank in particular our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins, and our producer, Adam Katura. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Rumble, and Parler, and our website. See you next time.